Hi, everybody. I hope you are doing well today. I am kind of chuckling at some of the conversation I hear coming from the hallway, it would be fun if you guys were hearing that. But this is the 15th week of this series that we are doing. Oh, hold on. Technical difficulty. All right, there we go. We're good now. What was I saying? 15th week that we're in this series. Originally this week, I had thought we would be moving into the New Testament and looking at the life and the person of Jesus. I decided to put that on pause for 1 week and deal with a portion of history that we kind of, as evangelicals, tend to leapfrog right over, and that's the intertestamental period between the book of Malachi, the end of the Old Testament, and the beginning of the New Testament and the birth of Jesus. We skip over it because there's nothing about it in our Bibles, and it is a period of relative silence from God and from the prophets, but it's not unimportant historically. So I thought today it'll be a shorter devotional live stream, and we're going to focus mainly or entirely on that intertestamental period, kind of an interlude in the drama of redemption that we've been looking at, that golden thread. But just because there's nothing about that period in our Bibles doesn't mean there weren't significant things happening. There were incredibly important things happening that will impact how we read our Bibles and how we understand the ministry of Jesus and the opposition of people like the Pharisees and the Sadducees to Jesus and what he was doing. So we'll do a bit of history and then talk about what was happening religiously during this period as well. So as we ended last week, the live stream, Nehemiah and Ezra had rebuilt the temple, rebuilt the city of Jerusalem. The Jews were still scattered all throughout. At that point, it was the Persian Empire, and there was a remnant that had come back to the land and were living there. Temple worship had been restored. The priesthood had been restored. But there was still this sense that, yes, we've returned from exile, but we're still living in exile in a way. We're still under Persian rule. We're not experiencing kind of this dawn of a new age that we had hoped for. Well, that was under the Persian Empire. Cyrus had allowed them to go back and repopulate the land, rebuild the temple. In 331, the Persian Empire gave way to the Greek Empire as Alexander the Great extended his rule. In 331, he conquers Persia. And under Greek rule, under Alexander the Great, one of the methods for the Greek Empire, especially under Alexander, extending and reinforcing its rule, was imposing Greek culture on the lands that they conquered, especially the Greek language. So Greek culture during this period saturates Jewish life in Palestine. Alexander doesn't live that long. He dies about the age of 32. So in 323, after his death, the Greek Empire, which has spread all the way to, I believe, India, is split into two different separate empires. The Ptolemy Empire, which is centered in Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, kind of situated, centered in Syria. Israel, for a long time, is kind of caught in the middle of the conflict between the Ptolemy and the Seleucid empires. And I think it's like 5 times that control over Palestine passes between Ptolemy and Seleucid kings in the first 20 years after Alexander's death. Eventually, the Ptolemy Empire solidifies its control over Palestine, and Israel is under Ptolemy rule for about 100 years. It's during this time that the Hebrew Bible is first translated into Greek. So the Hebrew Bible, which looks like this, and is read right to left. So if you want to find Genesis, you have to go to the back of the book and there you find Genesis. So this Bible is translated into Greek, which we call the Septuagint, and it looks very different. The Septuagint, the history behind that, the legend behind that, is that one of the Ptolemaic kings summoned 70, or sometimes it's 72, Jewish scholars, 6 from every tribe of Israel, to come and to translate the Hebrew Bible to Greek for him to put in his library. They were each of these scholars kept in a separate room and given the task of translating the Hebrew into the Greek. And at the end of the project, though they had not, this is the legend, though they had not conferred with one another at all, their translations matched perfectly. No discrepancies at all. That's legend, but we do have the Septuagint that comes out of this period. Eventually, the Ptolemies lose control of Palestine, and the Seleucids gain control in around 200-201 BC. This is important because a figure from the Seleucid Empire becomes incredibly important. His name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He reigned from 175 to 164 BC. During his reign of the Seleucid Empire, which included Palestine, Israel at this point, he was wrestling with threats from Rome, which was rising in power, and also threats of the incredible ethnic diversity within the empire. And so he often invaded and looted his client states, which included Israel, to pay his debts, and rigorously imposed Greek culture on those client states. It was Antiochus IV Epiphanes who looted the temple in Jerusalem and passed strict laws prohibiting things that were associated with the practice of Jewish religion. He forbade circumcision, Sabbath keeping, sacrifices. The Torah was collected and burnt, and Jews were forced to sacrifice to pagan gods. Those who disobeyed these mandates were executed, and executed very cruelly. It was under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, on December 25th, 167 BC, Antiochus IV sets up an altar to Zeus, the chief Greek god, in the temple in Jerusalem, and sacrifices a pig there. Just an abomination to the Jewish people, a total desecration of the temple. This leads directly to the Maccabean revolt. I'm going to try and get the name right. It's in 167 BC, same year as this desecration of the temple, that an elderly priest, Mattathias ben Johanan, who was ordered to offer a pagan sacrifice, refused. He not only refused, but he killed a compromising Jew who had offered the sacrifice and a Greek soldier who was overseeing the sacrifices. Eventually, he flees to the desert, and he dies within a year of his refusal to offer this sacrifice. But his son, Judah Maccabee, in 164, they've gone through this series of kind of guerrilla warfare, and in 164, he rides into Jerusalem, liberating it from the Seleucid rule. And he rides in with shouts of Hosanna and palm branches waving. He goes in and he cleanses the temple, he removes pagan images and altars, and rededicates the whole temple to the Lord. This is what the celebration of Hanukkah is all about the removal of the Seleucids from Jerusalem and the cleansing of the temple under Judah Maccabee. This is deeply meaningful to the people of Israel. It's like a second Exodus in a way, a defining moment. God had acted through Judah to liberate the people of God, and they're expecting even more. The Seleucids are finally completely expelled from Israel in 142 BC, so it takes about 20 years. And that leads to a period of Jewish independence for roughly 80 years under Judah's older brother Simon and his descendants. This becomes known as the Hasmonean Dynasty. The Hasmonean Dynasty, they're independent, but they're still enamored with pagan Greek culture. And so there's a lot of kind of compromise because they're compromised by pagan culture and by a desire to keep power. So they make compromises, especially with the rising power of Rome. The Roman armies come into Jerusalem in 63 BC, and basically they stay there for the next 500 years. This is, if you're familiar with Old Testament prophecies, Daniel's fourth beast, which you can read about in Daniel chapter 7. Rome rules Israel indirectly through puppet kings, including those Hasmonean kings. The last Hasmonean king was Herod the Great. And then after those kings kind of give way, they rule through governors, prefects, including Pontius Pilate. So that's kind of the history. During this period religiously, for the Jews, you see a lot of animosity towards Gentiles that was maybe always there, but it is magnified, amplified during this kind of hate period because they're under Greek rule and then Roman rule, which is worse than any of the other rules. So there's hatred of the Gentiles and hatred towards Jewish collaborators, people like tax collectors. You do have occasional uprisings where wannabe messiahs come onto the scene, mimicking in a way Judah Maccabees revolt. These are immediately suppressed by Rome and usually lead to mass crucifixions. But there's a deep longing for God to come and to do something important. There's this eschatological hope that is becoming more and more fervent, that this new age brought by the Messiah is going to dawn. God's going to do something. The Messiah is often viewed as a military figure or alternatively a priestly figure, but never a suffering servant kind of figure. The concept of the kingdom of God becomes ever more important to the people of Israel. And it's during this period that you have the rise of several new groups dating back to the Maccabean revolt. You have the Pharisees. It's a new group, a new kind of religious party in Israel. And that they come to prominence during the Hasmonean Dynasty because of Hasmonean compromise. They emphasize, the Pharisees, radical obedience to the law and hope of a revolutionary change to separate Israel from everything that was pagan. The Pharisees are influential in the synagogues as teachers of the law. Very similar to the Pharisees in their hopes and in what their diagnosis of the problem were the Essenes. They shared the same concerns that Israel was not pure enough, that they were compromising too much with pagan culture and foreign rulers. But they chose to withdraw from society. You may have heard of the Qumran community. That's where we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was an Essene community who believed that they alone were the true Israel, the remnant that hadn't compromised, that were maintaining faithfulness to God. Alongside the Pharisees and the Essenes, you have the Sadducees and the priests. They were more mainline. They were the official teachers of the law. They held positions of authority by the pleasure of those who were in charge, the rulers, the Romans. And so they're not revolutionary at all. They're pretty okay with the status quo. Now the Sadducees, the priests, the Pharisees, they make up the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin. Alongside those parties, you have the common people. Most of the common people had no religious party affiliation. They were living faithfully with a fervent expectation that the Messiah was coming. They weren't necessarily caught up into the political fervor or the ultra-conservative fundamentalist kind of Pharisee movement. They were just longing and hoping. There was approximately 500,000 Jews living in Palestine at that point, and more than 3 million scattered all throughout the Roman Empire. That's the stage that Jesus is about to step onto. I think we've set the stage theologically for the past 14 weeks, looking at the promises of various covenants and the prophetic literature. And this is the historical stage, what's been happening. So that's all I have for this week. Next week, I know we didn't look at any Bible this week, right? But it's important background that helps us understand our Bible. Next week, we'll dive into the New Testament and see how Jesus steps in as the main character that everything has been leading up to this point. Thank you for joining me. I know it was a short one, devotional this week, but I really look forward to next week diving into the New Testament. Have a good day, stay warm, stay safe, and look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.